Devaki, welcome to this iLoop conversation today. And I thought it'd be really helpful if you talked a little bit about your childhood, because you've mentioned to me that your childhood was slightly unorthodox, and I think it might set the scene for the rest of our conversation if you just gave us a brief glimpse on what your childhood was like.
Sure, sure. So that was what? I don't know how many years ago now. And what do we consider a childhood? I suppose I'll give you kind of a brief glimpse into 0 to 16 because that was the time that was really significant. So in from our previous conversations in what you've showed interest in. So yes, I was raised in Vancouver, Canada. My parents were no, my father was first generation. His parents were from South Africa and England, and my mother was French Canadian. So the French Canadian communities have been there for many, many years. Um, I think she's probably about fourth, fifth generation Canadian, with some First Nations, the Indigenous people, some of the mix in their family as well. So those are my parents, and they were a product of the '60s hippie movement, I would say, in the sense that they were university students who gave up the dream of materialism that they believed their parents had dedicated their lives to. Both my grandparents on both sides were politicians, a member of parliament on one side and a deputy minister of public affairs on the other side. So, obviously, upper middle class, big part of society, and both my parents decided, nope, veer off the other way. And in that heavy movement, it was a lot of activism, protests. My father occupied his university administration building for 2 weeks with his mates. So out of that came an interest in anything non-Western, I suppose, in a way. And because I think that happened to a lot of people of that generation, looking at the post-war materialism that had set in, which was just really an answer to having nothing and having, living in fear, to wanting stability and security. So everyone went into this place of stability and security. And then the children of that, my parents, felt that that was the focus. And it led them over. And plus, I think a big part of it was my father being a child of immigrants. So there wasn't that family stability on his side. So he was searching for that a lot. And I think his joining the hippie movement really kind of was tied into that. Plus, a quest for spirituality, which many of his generation were. So that led him to the Hare Krishna movement. Hare Krishna movement, if you're from the great thing about living in England now, I've been here for 12 and a half years with my husband and family. But the great thing about living here now is when you say Hare Krishna movement, everyone gives you a knowing nod. And I find that incredibly refreshing, because back home you do not get that knowing nod. You get a very perplexed, who are you, freak, kind of a look. I mean, I I love Canadians. I'm Canadian, so it's not a diss for Canadians, but it's just not. England is so close to India. There's such ties to India. So something like the Hare Krishnas, um, and George Harrison's involvement in the Hare Krishnas, and the temples that are here in England are very established and well known. So it's kind of more part of the culture, I think. So when I say I was raised a Hare Krishna, it's God, which is lovely. Um, so Western Canada Hare Krishna movement, at the time, my parents basically started the temple in Vancouver. There was no temple. Um, and I was born into it. So I had an older brother, and my mother was pregnant with me when she was joining when they were joining the Hare Krishnas. She didn't want to join, by the way. That was another sign of the times. Patriarchy was flourishing. So the men made the decisions for the family, more so back then. Um, yeah, so I was born into it and raised in what do you want to call it? A monastic environment, where austerity and poverty were celebrated and lived. And the members of the society gave up their entire lives, their name, their clothes, their bank accounts, everything. Everything that they knew previously was given away. And they shaved their heads, they wore robes of mendicants, India 500 years ago. Like they were emulating a movement called the Vaishnav movement, specifically following the teachings of Chaitanya, who was a saint about 500 years ago, and so it was very much based around something called Sankirtan, which was the idea of renouncing all material possessions, dedicating your life to the guru, and the cause of the movement, which was Sankirtan, which is to spread the names of God, and in our case, it was Krishna. So I grew up around this environment of Sankirtan. So we were, my parents were, and we would every weekend, sometimes more than that, we were out in public, dressed in our full saris. So the women wore saris, always had a covered head. You couldn't walk, you couldn't go without a covered head. The men wore dhoti and kurta, and we all wore the markings, the Vaishnava markings of tilak. So we were fully immersed and fully immersed in this new movement, and completely obvious that we didn't belong in everyday society. So when we went out to do Sankirtan on the streets of Vancouver downtown, you can imagine the interactions. So to set that scene, we were. I mean, obviously, some people liked us. Some people, the younger people, I think, who were searching also would come. Who are these people? Um, but we ran into a lot of animosity, and I didn't know it at the time, but I think some of that animosity had to do with young people getting brainwashed into a cult, which of course I didn't see at the time. I mean, I never thought of Hare Krishnas as a cult, but I think some people's families had lost their children to the Hare Krishnas.
Mm.
My grandparents were of those people, so there was probably a lot of animosity and anger towards that. I mean, if you met my parents before they joined the Hare Krishnas and after they joined the Hare Krishnas, they were almost unrecognizable, right?
And
So
did
they
they
went from,
find,
sorry?
sorry, I was going to say, did they find the things that they were looking for? They went looking for some spiritual answers, and, did do you feel that they found those things being part of that movement?
I think my father did. I think my mother, like she joined because she was from the eastern part of Canada. My father's from the western part of Canada, and it's like, I mean, it takes, if you're driving, it takes 5 days. So it's the French part and the Anglo part, which are completely different cultures. It's like being from two different countries. So I think my mother felt very isolated, and she was pregnant with me, and she had my brother who was a year. So I don't think she felt like she had the option, or maybe there was too much pride to go back to her family, so she joined kind of against her will. So I don't, and that caused a whole new set of things, right? You could imagine. But with my father, I think he did find what he was looking for. They stayed for 17 years. And he rose very quickly in a leadership position. I think he started the Hare Krishna Temple in Vancouver, grew that from nothing to a massive empire, a huge property in Burnaby, BC, Canada. Um, I think 20 acres, prime real estate, with the condominiums for all the members to live in, a huge amount of property around, built a massive temple, huge temple. And this was the environment we grew up in, right? So our community was first, the temple was first, the kids. We were it was supposed to be that the children were seen as, we would hear it all the time. You are the first generation, you are the real bhaktas, the real devotees, they were born into it, you're special, you're elevated, this is what we heard, but in reality, what we received was a different story. But anyway, I think my father, to answer your question, yes. He was looking for a second family. He was looking for a way to put spirituality first, and he found those things because it was community based, and I mean, everything about the Hare Krishna lifestyle was spiritually based. We would wake up at 3:30 in the morning, have 4 hours of arti ceremony, lectures, um, japa rituals for over 4 hours as a community, and then the rest of our day was either spent in service, as we would call it, which was, if you were a collector, which meant you would go out onto the streets and bring in money for the community to live off of, Or if you were a teacher, you would teach the kids. Or if you were just a family person, you look after your family, whatever it was, whatever your, everyone had to contribute to the community. So, and you would spend your whole day doing that. We would eat communally. All our festivals, which we had many of, because we celebrated all the Hindu festivals. So Janmashtami, Radhastami, Navratri, every Diwali wasn't big for us, I found that really strange. Anyway, um, yeah, so we celebrated all the religious holidays, and we brought in the public would be welcomed in on those days. So we were constantly interacting with the public as these sort of chosen few, right? These chosen few that would go out, and then the kids were literally paraded around as the chosen few to, kind of recruit people, right? It's like, oh yeah, the kids are, look how happy our children are. Poke, poke, smile, smile. Are you smiling big enough? Are you dancing big enough? Poke, poke, that kind of thing. Anyway,
So what was the
yeah,
reaction
I mean,
like?
and my father, he came from a leadership family. So I think finding leadership within the community and then, sorry?
It's okay, don't worry. There was a little bit of a lag there. But carry on. I was going to ask what was
Oh,
the impact on you as a child? You know, you grew up in this. You didn't know any different. What was your experience on the inside?
yeah, I mean, I loved it. I loved it. It was my community, and I consider myself a community person. If I look at it now, um, I didn't belong to my parents. I belonged to the community, right? So we were a community of 150 people. So I happen to think of how many aunties I had, like, and how many kids I had to play with. And because I was the president's daughter, I had free reign in the sense that I could run free, and my mom and dad were so busy running the temple, they didn't know what Devaki was up to, or, so it was kind of like, I mean, I think of my childhood as running in a sari, barefoot, sweaty through the forest, building forts with my friends, and tagging my little sisters along, and going and visiting the devotee's house and meeting and babysitting their kid, and going and meeting this devotee. If these are the positive aspects, and then constant feasts and constant celebrations, and as the girls were encouraged to be good cooks, good sewers, whatever, seamstresses, whatever you want to call that, good wives, good dancers, good musicians. And I mean, the positive for me in that is that dance became my passion at a very, very young age. I was introduced to Odissi dance when I was 5, and then Bharatanatyam later on. So that was a positive. It was like it caught my heart and it's never left. And then also growing up, even though our music wasn't classical Indian music, our music was bhajan, kirtan. So, but and my father was a musician, so he ended up being like known all over the world in the Hare Krishnas as he called a mantra rock pioneer. So he took the sort of the music of the 60s and merged it with the Hare Krishna Kirtan and came up with this sort of brand of kirtan that became very popular. So he was, I was always kind of, I got to go special places because of that. He actually had an airplane by the time I was, I think 12, and he would fly us to different festivals in LA or Denver and play his kirtan at these festivals. So these are I'm telling you all the fun perks of being the president's daughter, and the fun perks of being raised a Hare Krishna. And yeah, dance is still a huge part of my life, always will be, and music is a huge part of my life. Both my brothers were musicians as well, so and music was the one thing that transitioned me and my husband out of the Hare Krishnas in some kind of some kind of a bubble that let us have something. Um, so that's the positive aspect. The negative aspect, a complete lack of boundaries, which I'm 50 now and I'm still learning this. And when you live in a world and you live in a city like London and you have issues with boundaries and you're an artist, I think you can probably put two and two together and see what what that can create. Um, but yeah, so, and I mean, because we were living in this sort of by this, you know, we lived by the Vedas. Those were our Bible was the Bhagavad Gita, right? So we lived by the instructions of these scriptures, and we lived by the instructions of our guru Prabhupada, who came over from Calcutta when he was 65. So 69 in 1965 into the Bowery in New York. That's a whole other story. But so he kind of course, he created a way to live for his disciples. And one of those ways of living was, let's say, said renouncing everything and devoting your whole life to Krishna. And another one of those things was all the children were put into gurukulas, schools, by the time we were 4 and 5. Now, if your temple didn't have a gurukula, or if your father was a leader, which mine was, you had the option to be sent anywhere in the world to more established gurukulas that have reputation. So my brothers were shipped off at 4 to Dallas, Texas. I was shipped off at 5 to Seattle.
Wow.
Yeah, my other brother was shipped off at 6 to Pennsylvania. And then both my brothers were shipped off to India, to Vrindavan, when they were 9 and 12. So, I mean, you can imagine being shipped off when you're that age to strangers, complete strangers.
Yeah.
So, and then corporal punishment was in our teachings. So it was, yeah, it was part of it. Corporal punishment was part of the Gurukula system, which meant physical punishment. And the thing is physical punishment is one thing, because our teachers didn't have training. None of them are proper teachers. Oftentimes, it ended up being that the people who taught us were the people who couldn't do anything else. So they would be slotted into being our teachers, and some of them were sadistic. I mean, sadistic, and thought of torture.
What did they teach you? Was it sort of, it was a very different curriculum to what you would learn in a normal school, I imagine?
Yes. The curriculum, I mean, we were heavy on reading. So we were like, the Krishna kids were considered, we got tested all the time. And we were considered above, by the time I was 9, I was at a university level reading. Right.
Wow.
So we were taught to read at 5. I could read the Vedas. Right. So we were that was the positive, right? Our brains were really, because we didn't have television. We didn't have, there was the interaction, any interaction we had was person to person. So there was, I think, in a way, our brains were, that was a positive aspect, is that I was reciting Vedic sutras by the time I was 5, right? Like we all were, right? So yeah, but the curriculum was very focused on reading and writing, and then focused on Sanskrit. We learned Sanskrit. And then the girls, of course, we were really pushed into the sort of the housewifey kind of things, and luckily dance and music was in there, luckily. But yeah, so and the boys, that's why they were sent away often, is because there wasn't a strong enough curriculum and academic sense, and their education was taken way more seriously than the girls. So oftentimes the boys would get sent away, right? So they could be properly educated, whatever that meant. But yeah, so I mean, the teachers that were in that we so we would go and live with the teachers. So at 5 years old, I said goodbye to my mother, who had my sister on her hip and my little brother on her other hand. I said goodbye to my mother and went to live with strangers I've never met in my life, right? And yeah, and I thought it was a great adventure, right? Because there was all these girls I'd never met, and some of them were older and younger, and I was like, oh my god, party, great, lovely, all these new people, new ways. It was exciting. I learned, I think, on the 3rd day of that violence was around me at all times, and torture was around me at all times. And I had to learn the hard way, by complete surprise, which is probably the worst way you could learn for someone like me, because I'm a very sensitive person. But yeah, I learned by surprise, by trying to entertain the teacher and her like slapping me full on across the face. And it just, there's just, you didn't know what you did wrong, but you'd end up in the dungeon. It was like this like a dugout place that would stick you in, and you'd be in the complete dark in this dugout, and you didn't know where it was. You'd spend hours there. You didn't even know. I can't tell you what I did wrong. Or another famous torture was sticking you into ice cold showers with all your clothes on until you couldn't breathe. I mean, it's just endless. And I got the least of it because my father was a leader. Some of the girls, it's horrendous. So that was the very negative side of it, obviously. And things like, they were trying to follow Ayurveda, but these we're talking about, young lost hippie kids, that are like trying to implement Ayurvedic treatments to little kids, going, we don't know, and so they would pour hot oil in our ears, which, I mean,
Oh,
actually, if you look at it now, Ayurveda, putting, warm ghee or something in your ear is actually great for you. But so they would pour hot oil, but we'd get burned ears all the time, or they would give us, we were supposed to drink hot milk before bed. It would be so hot, it would be scalding our mouths, right? Like this strange thing, or like these experiments, and yeah. But in all that, we did get to go, and we had some crazy adventures. I mean, if I look back on my childhood, I remember some great old times. Very artistic, very creative. Our festivals were renowned. We got to paint and sew clothes for the deities with beautiful ornaments. I mean, we everything around us, like our temple was made of solid marble and stained glass, and we got to help with the stained glass. We got to help build the temple, the gold leaf. There was like we lived in this sort of ornate richness that you don't live in the Western world, and we got to live in that.
so
But
then
then,
there's a contradiction in there, isn't there? Because the 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 principle behind going down that path was to denounce everything that was materialistic and opulent, and yet here was they were building things that obviously looked, they were on prime real estate, they were opulent, they there were some of these practices clearly were probably never intended to be cruel or torturous, and so the interpretation of what was meant to be spiritually uplifting was a very different one, is kind of the feeling I'm getting here.
yeah, for sure, very very much that contradiction of us living as mendicants, and the temple, the deities being treated like rajas. So there was that, definitely. But the philosophy behind that was that everything was for Krishna. That was our mantra. Everything is for Krishna. So you give everything. Family, the word family didn't exist. And it was discouraged. It was like, no, you know, children are for Krishna. Everything is for Krishna. And I think that really, and it, I mean, there's since then 100 of us kids had a class action lawsuit, after we had left and grown up a bit and gone, oh my god. Um, we had a class action lawsuit, and we sued the Hare Krishnas for millions. We did by the time they were smart, and by the time it came down to the financial aspect of it, it was not that much, but it was something. Um, but yeah, so there, yeah, I mean, if I go back to those days, yeah, I think what it was is there were no checks and balances in place. Devotees were all new at this, and they were taking an ancient practice that worked 500 years ago in rural India, and they were transplanting it into cities in America or Canada. And I mean, come on, there was just no context for it. There was no knowledge, understanding, no training, no checks and balances, other than Prabhupada, who was one guru to manage an entire movement. So it just, it ended up being a schmoz. And the kids paid the price. My generation, we paid the price. My brother took his life 9 years ago, and it was a direct result for what he went through as a child. And many, many, many children have taken their life. Many, 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 many. It's the percentage is so high. Yeah, so that's the tragedy of it all. But I'm still here, and my other my other five siblings are still here, and we're all building our lives, and maybe trying to even especially my sisters, my younger sisters, they all have PhDs and work for the government, and live their lives, and it's like completely opposite to how we were raised. I've chosen the artistic life because I have to, for myself, for my expression. But yeah, yeah, I guess, yeah.
So what is the sort of, obviously this podcast, we want to sort of identify a particular turning point, and that itself, that childhood is a very, very, you know, it's a very unusual one. Most people would not have had that kind of childhood. So would you say that the leaving of that mm, commune and that group, was that the turning point for you, or is there something else that you'd like to talk about today?
The turning point, I mean, to be honest, that was probably the most, in a way, the most traumatic part of our lives was leaving the Hare Krishnas, because we left the safety of our commune. It was the only thing we knew, the only reality we knew was the philosophy that the Hare Krishnas taught us, you know. So that was a very, very traumatic period. And my husband and I, because my husband had joined as a teenager, and he came to Vancouver with his guru from England, from here. He's not from here; he's from Trinidad, but he came via England. And he was here, and so we left together. And we left, actually, we got together playing music in a band for one of the Hare Krishna festivals, the Rath Yatra festival. And and him and I clung to each other for dear life, kind of thing. As my parents were leaving, they were, their whole lives blew up. It was like, it was, yeah, it was insane what
What was the
happened.
reason that they finally decided to leave?
Well,
And
I think it
what
was a combination of things. We sat my dad down one time, me and my two brothers. We sat him down and we told him everything that had happened, in all the schools. And I mean, I'll never forget that day. It was like his body was being riddled with bullets. I mean, his head was hanging in shame. I mean,
he
you
didn't
know,
know? That's amazing. He had no
no,
idea.
and that's the sad part, is how disconnected that my parents were from us, and our parents were more in our lives, than a lot of other parents, because we were taught, it was part of the philosophy that the kids, and that your kids are not your kids, they're Krishna's kids. They belong to the Guru. They belong to the Gurukula. So
So that must have really shattered him to hear what you'd gone through
yeah,
and all the
yeah,
other
and
children.
yeah, it did. And but at the same time, like I said, so he had lost his position. He got While he was busy managing other parts of the movement, he lost position back home. So he came home to kind of a broken man, in the sense that the devotees in the temple were like, "Oh, you're off reforming the movement, are you? You're off telling the gurus that they should get off their high horse. Well, we think you should get off your high horse and come down from presidency, and we should rule as a, autonomous, more democratically." And so his position, so he was kind of left with what do I have now? Um, so I think it coincided with us telling him this stuff. And my brother was 17, I was 16, my younger brother was 14. So it was like we were teenagers. There wasn't any schooling for teenagers. That was the big thing. It's like all the schooling went up to a certain level and then stopped. So there wasn't really any future in terms, the movement wasn't old enough to have any kind of future for its children.
So your father obviously had by this time become disillusioned and realized that it wasn't quite what he had thought it was going to be, and so you and Thomas, your husband, you by this time you'd met,
Yeah.
and what was it that gave you the courage to leave the commune? Because even though it was your whole life, I can imagine the thought of leaving for you must have been scary. For him, maybe not so much because he came in a bit later, didn't he?
Yeah.
Yeah. So tell me about that.
I mean, I don't know if I would have left if my brothers hadn't. It was my brothers that spearheaded it, to be honest. They're the ones, that really pushed my dad, actually. I found that out later, but I don't know if I would have left. I mean, the thing is that Thomas, him and I, when we started hanging out, it was kind of around the time that we were leaving as well. So the fact that he was exiting at the same time of his own accord, I think, and then us getting together probably sealed the deal, I think. So I didn't see it as a courageous move. I saw it as, my family is doing this, Thomas is doing this. It's the next step. I don't think I felt much autonomy back then. I mean, I did in a sense. I actually went and got my own education sorted. I went to and got my GED, which is a general education diploma, completely of my own accord. Got myself there, signed myself up. I think I was 14 when I started that. I started my own Bharatanatyam dance lessons of my own accord. I wasn't making any money. I found a way to do it. So I did take initiative. I'm not saying I wasn't courageous, but I think, in terms of leaving the Krishnas, I never thought of it as my personal decision. um, I think for me, the courage came, the real turning point for me was probably come after moving here and realizing at about maybe 45, realizing that, my kids were moving on, and um, you know, I was being triggered constantly at in my different jobs, and it became excruciating. I couldn't, the triggers were becoming so constant and so painful that I knew that I had spent a lifetime surviving this crazy childhood, raising 4 children with my husband, having a career in music and in the arts, always pushing all of that stuff aside to live a life. And all my mantra was, you're not getting me down. Any of those people, all the experiences that I had that were very, you know, abusive on many levels, I was like, no freaking way that your abuse is going to keep me from living my life. No freaking way. And no freaking way are my children going to, you know, suffer from what these people did to me. Right. It's like, we're going to have a life. And so that's what kept me going. And I, you know, because I've been brought up in this artistic communal environment, that's what we recreated for our kids and our family and our life. And when we discovered music together in a real kind of almost in a professional way, Thomas and I was 27, and then we started touring and we started recording albums and we started, you know, gaining following. And this is when my life made sense. This is when both of us went, because he's from a mixed family in Trinidad. His story is crazy as well. And neither of us felt like we belonged. We ended up in the Okanagan, Canada, together as a mixed race couple back then, you know, with the crazy backgrounds that we had. And we were living in a town of 40,000 people that was famous for having the most churches on one street. So we're talking Bible Belt. we're talking, um, we're talking, you know, a lot of farmers, a lot of, you know, it was not a culturally rich, diverse place by any stretch of the imagination. I think Thomas was probably the only person with his heritage in the whole entire region. Like, so it was just, that's where we ended up, and that's where we raised our family. So yeah, for us to feel any way connected to anything of who we were, we had to go to the arts, and it's who we were anyway. But the music and art gave us a sense of belonging, and we felt embraced by the community, and so it gave us a life. And you know, so I'm forever grateful that was, you know, my heritage coming out of the Hare Krishnas, and that was who my dad was, my brothers were. So you know, but then the real turning point where I could say I will tell you I am courageous is when I realized at that age, when I realized that, I guess it was on 45, that these triggers that kept, it was working here in London in the arts. And I just, every relationship, I just felt like I was giving 150%, because that's what I was used to doing back home. I was used to giving 100%, 150% for my band, you know, travel, you know, insane schedules that would knock most people off their, I was like, I can do it. Humans only use 10%. That was my mantra. Humans only use 10% of their brain. You know, we only use 10% of our brain. I can do it. I could do it. So we used to put on this 3-day festival. We had 4 kids. It was, you know, it was crazy. We did it for 10 years. So coming here to the UK, I'm like, oh, I'm just going to take that same passion that I have that's brought me forward in the arts in Canada, and here, and it worked. But what kept happening was people were like, thank you very much. I'll take some of that. I'll take some of that. I'll take some of that. And I didn't feel fed back, right? I mean, in Canada, because I was part of a small community of people that I knew, I felt like I was fed back, right? And it took a while to establish here and make money. So all that kind of thing, I felt very, 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 very depleted and used. And I think I did it to myself in the sense that I didn't know any better, you know? Yeah, I would just gave too much for what I was receiving. And I believed with every part of my heart that if I gave, it would come back. And I think that's the idea of karma that I grew up with. So karma was such a massive part. I mean, 365 days of the year for 16 years, I heard that karma, you give, you get, right? And that selflessness that we were taught for our community. You give of yourself for the community, for the greater good. So that's in my ethos. So coming here, I thought, I'll do what I did back home. And I saw some success, and I have I have some beautiful contacts that I've made, and I have met some wonderful, wonderful artists, and I will hold on to those special people forever. And Thomas has been able to collaborate with some people that have won Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. Like, so we gained from it. I'm not saying we haven't, but it's just here, and yeah, it did me in. After like the third job here in the arts, I went, something's wrong. This keeps happening to me, where I feel completely used and taken advantage of, and I'm like, something's got to change. And so then I went, and at the same time I was studying, because I was wanting to be a teacher. I thought that was going to be my next sort of phase in life, and then got scared away because I was at a very leftist university who taught me that the education system in the UK was actually completely going downhill. So I was like, I can't work inside of a conservative education system. I'm an artist. I've got to find another way. So then I went and did my master's in movement psychotherapy at Goldsmiths. So I was while this was all happening with my job, where things were falling apart so badly, and the triggers and the pain was I mean, I didn't know how I was going to get through each day. When I think about it now, I mean, I was in tears every day, 2 3 times a day. If I didn't have certain friends or Thomas or people in place, I don't actually know how I would have survived. It was that bad.
What kind of things were triggering you? Was it the fact that you were showing up and you were willing to do 150%, and you felt that people just took advantage and that they didn't support you? I mean, can you sort of give us an example of the kind of things that you experienced?
Yeah, it felt like it was coming from all directions after a while, and I guess because I'm a spiritual person, I think that I put that up to the universe trying to shake me up and saying, you've got to face what's going on, Devaki. You've got to stop and breathe and look and heal and move on. And I kept saying, this is my way. My way is to work. I watched my mother do it, work 17, 18-hour days, 7 days a week. I saw her do that, work herself to the bone for her community. And so I was doing the same thing, but just in a different way. And so, I mean, an example would be, I'm not going to name any names, but it just felt like people figured me out. They figured me out, and they knew I would never play the hard game. They knew that I couldn't play that hard game. I couldn't do what they could do to me. I couldn't be, I couldn't do that thing. And I remember the day when I said, you can do whatever you want to me. I'm never going to play your game. Never. I'm never going to play that hard game. I'm never going to be that dog eat dog. That's not me. And if that's the only way I can win inside myself. That's the only way I can hold on to myself, is to know, no matter what games you play with my head, no matter what you take from what I give, you can't take that away from me. I'm not going to be you. It was torture, pure torture. Um, and I found a therapist then. I said, okay. And I didn't want a regular therapist. I wanted, because I'm so up in here. When you've lived a lot of trauma as a child, I'm sure many people have shared the same trait. When you live through a lot of trauma, your brain becomes it's like your tentacles, your antenna, right? So your brain becomes your way of surviving. You become like you become like a super antenna, kind of like, you just you take in every bit of information. You can soak in 20 people's agendas. You can walk into a room and know what every single person is there for and what they're doing and it's just, you become this like hyper sensitive, aware person to survive your trauma. And I mean, thank God I had that ability, because if I didn't, right? What's the other thing? Some people, they don't have that ability for their brain to kind of take over and figure things out. Well, like my brother and sister, who were very, very, very smart too. I'm not saying they're not smart, but they acted out everything. So if someone hurt them, they acted it out. They got in way more trouble than I did, but they held on to their hearts. Yeah. For me, I felt like I gave it away, because I had to survive. I had to please everybody. Okay, so what does this person want? I'll be that. What does that person want? I'll be that. I'll be that for every single person. I will please them to survive. Right? So I learned that. And my brain was what kept me figuring it out always. What does that person need? You know? And, you know, yeah, so that was kind of, I guess, I knew that I didn't want a talk therapist. I didn't want someone who was gonna, I was gonna be able to talk. I could talk circles around therapists. I'll tell you.
I think the thing is, you're so aware of the thing is you're so aware of what's actually going on for
Mm,
you, and why you are the way you are. So I can understand why talk therapy wouldn't really have helped, because you already know that.
yeah.
And so talking about it is not necessarily going to create any way of getting out of that particular trap. I think what's interesting for me, I mean, is you mentioned obviously that you became really good at spotting danger for yourself and
Mm,
figuring out what you needed to do to prevent that from happening. So, like when you talked about your experience at school, you got good at entertaining your teacher to minimize the the pain that she was going to potentially inflict on you. And I wonder if you took that sort of way of surviving into the workplace as well, that you got really good at anticipating other people's needs and pleasing them so that they wouldn't turn around and make you feel bad. Is that right?
that's exactly it.
So at what point did you actually, because it I think you talked about boundaries. You mentioned that that everyone in the community couldn't have boundaries, or were trained not to have boundaries because their whole purpose was to serve. But I suppose in a community where everyone is like that, there is the game you're playing means that you do get something back when you give, because
Yeah.
those are the rules of the game. But when you apply those rules to a game where that's not those are not the rules. So it feels like when you came into work, in the jobs you were doing, the rules of engagement were very different, but you didn't adapt to those rules. You were still playing on the same rules where there was more fairness, maybe. Yeah, I can see that. So, at what point did you get really clear on what it is that you wanted? Because it also feels like for whole of your childhood, you were never asked that question because it was not relevant. What you wanted didn't matter because you were there to please Krishna, and you were there to please other people. And it makes complete sense that you became a people pleaser.
Mm.
So tell me about what happened for you to break that cycle that was clearly depleting you.
It was it was it was my work situation turning into a firing squad. That's what it felt like. It felt like I was being attacked from all angles. And people that I thought I trusted turned on me and pretended that they weren't turning on me. And I got it from every angle, literally every angle. And I felt myself crumbling. And I've never felt that before. In every situation that I've been in my life, I've been able to, in every work situation I've been able to figure it out. And I've been able to, you know, adapt, work my magic. It worked before in so many different cases, but it didn't work. And you know, maybe I'm only what, like, how many years now? When that was 2017 is when I stopped. So I'm just so what we are now 4 years away. I mean, I think as we come away, time heals all wounds, because I think because you have perspective. And I like to think I'm always growing and changing, like many of us are. Um, so I feel like the more time I have away, I might have more answers. Right now, I guess I kind of look at it. I tie it in with the great turning, the great becoming, which is when a woman hits this age where her children are leaving home, and you know your body changes, and everything that worked before isn't working anymore. I had a hysterectomy during that time in 2016. I had a hysterectomy. So that, it was, I feel like it was all somehow tied together. And I think, give me 2 or 3 more years, I'll have more of a solid answer. But I feel like I just knew that that was not the old ways that I was working was not working anymore. something had to change. So this, finding this therapist, the somatic therapist, and her helping me to really listen to my body. um, I spent 4 years with her. 3 of those years I had to be with her because my course, my movement psychotherapy course, required that you have a minimum of 200 hours of personal therapy. But it coincided nicely, and the course itself was very, very transformative. So it was kind of all happened at the same time, me knowing this, my old ways, what's got me and helped me survive to this point is no longer working. Um, my body and everything inside of me is saying no. I didn't know how, putting one foot in front of the other to survive those days was all I could do. And I did it for my kids. And I know so many mothers will say the same thing. We put one foot in front of the other for our kids. And, you don't want to put that pressure on them. Got to be careful not to tell them that too many times. But, um, but yeah, it was them. And I wanted them to know that I could move past the the confines of my childhood, the things that kept me acting in a way that didn't serve my best, highest good, that didn't serve me walking free and true to myself in this world. I want them to see that it's possible in life to completely transform. So I knew heading into therapy, I knew. And the further I went into that journey of therapy, and the further I went into the journey of my movement psychotherapist course, it got harder and harder and harder. And it was, I mean, though that's where I can tell you I was courageous, because it was like someone taking a knife and carving your insides out. That's what some of those therapy sessions felt like. And that's what some of the work I was doing in the course felt like. It was literally torture. Um, but so I can tell you that's where my courage came out. And I'm very, very thankful that I had the courage to push through, and come to the other side, because I feel like I'm on the other side now.